Grace Thompson sat quietly in her first-class seat on Flight 287 to London, reviewing notes for tomorrow's investment meeting. Her dark fingers traced along spreadsheet numbers, calculating potential returns for Blackwell Pension Fund's newest venture. At 42, with grey just starting to appear at her temples, Grace had worked twice as hard as her colleagues to become Chief Investment Officer, managing billions in assets for thousands of pensioners who would never know her name. The cabin smelled of fresh coffee and expensive perfume. Grace smoothed her navy suit jacket and smiled at the memory of her grandmother Edith telling her, "Dress for the job you've earned, not the one they think you deserve." 20 years of perfect credit, countless red-eye flights, and weekends lost to spreadsheets had earned her this seat. Flight attendant Emma approached, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. A tall man in an expensive suit stood behind her. "Ma'am, I need you to move to economy. This seat has been reassigned," Emma said, her voice clipped. Grace looked up calmly, reached for her handbag, and produced her boarding pass. "There must be a mistake. I booked this seat months ago for this meeting. See seat 2A. The flight attendant barely glanced at the ticket. "It's company policy. We need this seat." "Which policy exactly?" Grace asked, aware of eyes turning toward them from nearby seats. Her heart began to beat faster, but her voice remained steady. "I've flown with National Airways for years. I'm a platinum member." "The policy regarding seating adjustments," Emma replied without explanation. "Mr. Richards here needs to be seated." Grace noticed other passengers watching now. An older woman across the aisle frowned and whispered to her husband. A young man had taken out his phone and was pointing it in their direction. "I understand emergencies happen," Grace said, "but I'd appreciate knowing the specific policy that allows confirmed bookings to be changed after boarding. Perhaps we could check with the captain." Emma's face hardened. "Security," she called. Instead of answering, 2 guards appeared within moments, their blue uniforms making them look more like police than airline staff. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the taller one said. "I've done nothing wrong," Grace said firmly. "I simply asked which policy allows you to remove me from my confirmed seat." "Please don't make this difficult," the shorter guard said, reaching for her elbow. Grace stood before he could touch her. She gathered her laptop and handbag with deliberate slowness, aware that causing a scene would only reinforce stereotypes she'd fought against her entire career. "I'll need the reason for my removal documented, please. And a refund." As they escorted her past rows of staring passengers, some looking away in embarrassment, others openly watching, Grace noticed Mr. Richards being seated in what had been her seat. He was already ordering champagne, his white hair perfectly styled, his pale hand waving dismissively as if shooing away a fly. The humiliation burned in her chest like acid. 20 years of professional success, managing £40 billion, salve assets, and still this. The familiar taste of injustice filled her mouth, but Grace kept her spine straight, her gaze forward, remembering her grandmother's words. "Your dignity isn't something anyone can take from you." In the jetway, the guards turned immediately toward another gate, clearly assuming she would follow meekly. Grace stopped. "I'll find my own way to customer service," she said coolly, "and then I'll be making some calls." The guards looked surprised but shrugged and continued on. Grace walked slowly toward the terminal, her mind already shifting from hurt to something sharper, more purposeful. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. She had 5 hours before her meeting, plenty of time to make a few inquiries about National Airways' investment structure. As she walked, Grace thought about power, not the kind that pushed people from seats, but the kind that moved markets. The kind she wielded every day, the kind that until now she had never considered using quite like this. Sitting alone at the airport terminal, Grace watched travelers hurry past with their rolling suitcases and takeaway coffees. Outside, planes took off into the cloudy afternoon sky, carrying hundreds of passengers who hadn't been publicly humiliated. She touched her temple where a headache was forming and closed her eyes. In moments like these, her mind always returned to Little Oakfield, the small coastal town where she grew up. After losing her parents in a car accident when she was just 11, Grace had been raised by her grandmother Edith in a small blue house at the end of Cherry Lane. Money had always been tight. Edith had worked as a school cook, keeping odd hours and taking on extra shifts whenever possible. Her wrinkled hands always smelled of lemon soap and bread dough. "Remember who you are," Edith would say, whenever Grace came home crying after some schoolyard slight. "Your worth isn't decided by others." Grace had taken those words to heart. While other teenagers spent weekends at the cinema or beach, she worked evenings at Mr. Parker's corner shop, stacking tins and working the till. Her school uniform had been second-hand, her textbooks borrowed, but her marks had been perfect. When the scholarship letter from London University arrived, Edith had cried happy tears into her apron. "This isn't about a seat," Grace whispered to herself now, pulling out her phone. The screen showed 3 missed calls from her team, wondering where she was. Instead of returning them, she dialed a different number. "William speaking," answered her assistant, his voice crisp and efficient. "Will, I need you to gather some information." "Urgently," Grace said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger still simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Of course, Miss Thompson. What do you need?" "I want to know everything about National Airways, their financial structure, major shareholders, board members, recent performance. And I want to know exactly how much exposure Blackwell Pension Fund has to them across all our portfolios." "This sounds serious. Are you all right?" William asked, his typing already audible in the background. "I'm fine. I'll explain later. How quickly can you get this?" "Give me an hour. I'll send it all to your secure email." "Thank you, Will." Grace ended the call and stared out at the runway. While waiting, memories flooded back, unwelcome but persistent. Professor James at university, peering over his glasses to suggest she might be more comfortable in a different field after she'd scored highest on his economics exam. The client in her first job who had handed her his empty coffee cup, mistaking her for the secretary, despite her being the only person in the meeting room with financial projections. The countless times she had arrived early, stayed late, triple-checked her work, knowing that as both a woman and black, she had to be twice as good to be taken half as seriously. 20 years of these moments. 20 years of smiling through clenched teeth, of explaining her credentials, of being interrupted in meetings and having her ideas repeated by male colleagues to approval. 20 years of being the first or only in rooms full of men who looked nothing like her. At the next gate, a mother struggled with a crying baby while trying to fold a stroller. Without thinking, Grace walked over and held the baby while the grateful mother collapsed the pushchair. The infant stopped crying, almost immediately looking up at Grace with curious eyes. "Thank you," said the mother, a blonde woman about Grace's age. She wore a wedding ring that caught the light. "They never make it easy for us, do they?" "No," Grace replied, handing back the baby. "They don't." Returning to her seat, Grace felt a shift inside her. She wasn't just tired, she was determined. As Chief Investment Officer, managing $40 billion in pension funds, she had spent her career helping others secure their futures. Teachers, nurses, factory workers, people like her grandmother, depended on her decisions to ensure their retirement years would be comfortable. Perhaps it was time to use that power differently. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email from William, faster than expected. Grace opened the file and began to read, her eyes widening slightly at what she saw. National Airways had been struggling financially for years, using glossy marketing to hide declining service and increasing customer complaints. Blackwell Pension Fund held approximately $1.3 billion in direct and indirect investments in the airline. $1.3 billion, a number so large it was almost abstract, but not to Grace. To her, it represented leverage and responsibility. The boardroom. On the 30th floor of Blackwell Tower fell silent as Grace finished describing the incident. The morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished oak table, where 5 people sat perfectly still. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Oliver Mills, the cautious chairman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat first. At 68, he had survived 3 market crashes and believed strongly in careful, measured responses. "I'm deeply troubled by what you've shared, Grace." Around the table sat the rest of the Blackwell Pension Fund Investment Committee. Margaret Wilson, thin and precise with her calculator-quick mind, always focused on numbers rather than emotion. Her pen hadn't stopped moving throughout Grace's account, jotting figures and questions in her neat handwriting. Thomas Reed, broad-shouldered and direct, had initially doubted Grace's appointment years ago, but had become her strongest ally after she'd guided them safely through the financial crisis. He now watched her with concern in his eyes. Two newer committee members, Elizabeth Baker and James Harlow, exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had less history with Grace, but had quickly come to respect her judgment. "Before we continue," Grace said, her voice calm despite having barely slept, "I want to make it clear that I'm bringing this to the committee, not because of personal humiliation, but because I believe it indicates a systemic issue that affects our investment priorities." "Understood," Oliver nodded. "What are you suggesting?" Grace placed her hands flat on the table. "First, I'd like to know exactly how much exposure we have to National Airways." Margaret didn't need to check her notes. "About $1.3 billion across various portfolios. They're a significant holding in our transportation sector investments, both direct equity and through bonds." The number hung in the air. $1.3 billion represented the retirement hopes of thousands of teachers, nurses, and civil servants who trusted Blackwell with their futures. "And what's our policy regarding social responsibility in investments?" Grace asked. Though she knew the answer well, Thomas leaned forward, his voice firm. "Companies must demonstrate ethical practices consistent with our values. It's not just words on paper. We've divested from firms with poor environmental records and labor practices before." "I'm not suggesting this out of anger," Grace said carefully, very aware that as the only black person and one of just two women in the room, her emotions would be scrutinized differently. "But I believe National Airways has demonstrated a pattern of troubling behavior. My experience may be just one example." Grace opened a folder and distributed reports showing customer complaint data, diversity statistics, and recent negative headlines about National Airways. "William helped me gather these overnight. National Airways has faced 3 discrimination lawsuits in the past year alone. Their customer satisfaction scores are the lowest in the industry, and their treatment of staff, particularly women and minorities, appears problematic." Margaret studied the numbers with a frown. "Their financial performance has been declining. Too, returns are down 12% while competitors are up. This isn't just about one bad experience," Grace continued. "It's about whether this company aligns with our investment principles and whether they're a sound long-term investment for our pensioners." The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours. They reviewed alternative investments that could replace National Airways in their portfolios. They calculated potential losses and gains. They considered the timing of any move, aware that their decisions moved markets. Elizabeth raised concerns about appearing reactive. James worried about setting precedents. Thomas pointed out similar divestments they'd made from companies with poor environmental records. They ordered lunch and kept talking. The sunlight moved across the boardroom floor. Finally, Oliver called for a vote. "All in favor of immediate divestment from National Airways across all portfolios?" 5 hands rose without hesitation. $1.3 billion, Oliver said quietly, removing his glasses to polish them. "That's what dignity is worth." As the meeting adjourned, Thomas stayed behind with Grace. "You know what happens next," he said. "When a fund our size moves, people notice. The press will ask questions." Grace nodded, gathering her papers. "I'm prepared for that." "Are you sure you want this fight?" "It will become personal," Grace thought. Of her grandmother, Edith, who had cleaned school kitchens for 40 years, never missing a day, who had raised her to stand tall. "It already is personal," she replied. "For everyone who's ever been told it's company policy, when what they really mean is you don't matter." The news broke 2 days later on a rainy Tuesday morning. "Major pension fund pulls $1.3 billion investment from National Airways," read the headlines across financial papers and news websites. The story spread quickly from business sections to front pages. National Airways stock plummeted by 15% before noon. Trading was briefly halted to prevent panic selling. Their initial response, a generic statement about reviewing the incident and taking all complaints seriously, only worsened matters as other investors began asking hard questions about company culture and customer treatment. By afternoon, 3 other pension funds had announced reviews of their National Airways holdings. The airline's competitors watched carefully, neither celebrating nor commenting publicly on their rivals' troubles. In her modest 2-bedroom flat in West London that evening, Grace's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her simple home with its comfortable sofa and walls lined with books felt like a sanctuary amid the storm she had unleashed. She had prepared a single careful statement and referred all callers to it, declining further comment. Journalists wanted exclusive statements. Investment firms wanted insight into Blackwell's next moves. Former colleagues expressed both support and concern about potential backlash, but the call that mattered most came just after 7 o'clock from a small coastal town 3 hours away. "Saw the news, love. Are you all right?" Her grandmother's voice carried the familiar warmth that had sustained Grace through every challenge of her life. "I'm fine, Gran. Just doing what you taught me. Standing up for what's right." Rain pattered against the windows of Grace's flat, creating streams that distorted the city lights outside. She curled her legs beneath her on the sofa, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold during earlier calls. "They're saying on the telly that you caused quite a stir. The airline people look worried." Edith's voice held a mixture of pride and concern. "It wasn't just me. The whole committee voted together. But it was your voice that started it," Edith said softly. "Is this about revenge, Grace?" she asked gently, in the direct way she had always spoken to her granddaughter, never sugarcoating difficult questions. Grace watched the raindrops racing down her window, thinking carefully before answering. "No," she replied finally. "It's about accountability, about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others, and about showing them who you are," Edith added. "The little girl who used to help me in the kitchen has moved mountains today." After talking with her grandmother, Grace switched off her phone and sat in silence with her thoughts. She remembered the humiliation on the plane, the eyes of other passengers watching her removal. But stronger than that memory was the image of Blackwell's boardroom and 5 hands raised in agreement, a recognition that some principles mattered more than profit. At 9 the next morning, William called to inform her that National Airways CEO Robert Parker had requested an urgent meeting. "He wants to speak with you personally," William said. "Not the full committee, just you." Grace considered this. Robert Parker was famous for his direct approach and rare public appearances. 62 years old, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, he had worked his way up from pilot to executive over 30 years. He rarely apologized and never backed down from a fight. "Tell him I'll meet tomorrow morning at our offices," Grace instructed. "And William, make sure the media doesn't get wind of this." "Already handled," William assured her. "But Grace, what's your plan here? They'll try to intimidate you, maybe even threaten legal action." Grace thought about her grandmother's question. Was this about revenge? A part of her had certainly felt satisfaction watching National Airways stock fall, but that feeling had quickly hollowed. "My plan is to listen," she said, "and then to speak truthfully." When Robert Parker arrived the next morning, immaculately, dressed with just a hint of worry creasing his confident expression, Grace agreed to meet him, not with triumph, but with hope for genuine change. She instructed the receptionist to bring coffee for both of them, and waited, standing by the window of her office, looking out at the city she had fought so hard to conquer. 6 months later, Grace stood before a different kind of audience in the gleaming glass-walled conference room of National Airways headquarters. The 20 people around the table formed the airline's newly created Ethics and Customer Experience Advisory Board, a diverse group including industry experts, customer advocates, and former critics of the company. Through the windows, planes taxied on distant runways, their blue and silver livery catching the afternoon light. Grace adjusted her red jacket and took a deep breath before addressing the room. The airline had undergone a remarkable transformation since that day on the CE plane. The meeting between Grace and Robert Parker had lasted 5 hours, beginning with tension but ending with a surprising alliance. Parker, after initially defending his company, had finally listened to the recordings from passengers who had witnessed Grace's removal. The next day, he had called an emergency board meeting, What followed was unprecedented in the industry. Robert Parker had publicly apologized, not with a carefully worded statement, but in person at a press conference where he admitted that National Airways had failed its commitment to treat all passengers with dignity. He fired the staff directly involved and, more importantly, implemented comprehensive training programs across all levels of the company. Their new passenger rights policy, drafted with input from civil rights organizations, was becoming an industry standard. Other airlines were scrambling to adopt similar measures. The incident that brought us together was painful, Grace told the room now, her voice steady and clear. But what matters more is what we've built from it. She gestured toward the presentation screen showing customer satisfaction scores that had risen dramatically in recent months. Complaints of discriminatory treatment had dropped by 87%. Employee satisfaction had improved as well. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure if genuine change was possible, Grace continued. I've been proven wrong in the best possible way. Robert Parker, sitting at the end of the table, nodded. Their professional relationship had evolved into something neither had expected. A partnership built on painful honesty and shared determination to create lasting change. When Blackwell Pension Fund conditionally reinvested $800 million 2 months earlier, they had tied it to measurable diversity metrics and customer satisfaction scores. The agreement included quarterly reviews and the right to withdraw funds if targets weren't met. This isn't just about one airline, Grace explained to the board members. It's about setting a standard for how companies respond when they fail, not with defensiveness, but with courage to become better. After the meeting, Grace checked in for her flight to visit her grandmother, Edith. It was her first time flying National Airways since the incident. She had declined the company's offers of free first-class tickets, choosing instead to experience their service as any regular passenger would. On board, Grace noticed the difference immediately, not just in how she was treated, but in the respectful atmosphere throughout the cabin. Flight attendants made eye contact with every passenger. The pilot personally welcomed an elderly man who needed assistance boarding. Small changes, but meaningful ones. As the plane rose above London, Grace thought about how far they had all come. The newspaper headlines had faded, the stock price had recovered, but something more important had been built in the process. Template for accountability that other companies were beginning to follow. Later that year, Grace started a mentorship program for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Using her connections in the financial world, she created opportunities for students who, like her younger self, had talent but lacked access. Every Saturday morning, she met with them in a community center near her old neighborhood. Her first piece of advice was always the same. Your value isn't determined by how others see you, but by knowing your worth and using it to lift others. 1. Spring evening. Grace sat in the audience of a small university hall, watching her first group of mentees graduate. Among them was Lisa, a brilliant young woman who had secured a position at a top investment firm. When Lisa had first joined the program, she had been too shy to speak in group meetings. Now she stood confidently at the podium, addressing her peers. Some people climb mountains just to prove they can, Lisa said. Others climb them to build a path for those who follow. Grace smiled, knowing her grandmother Edith would be proud. Not just of what Grace had accomplished, but of how she had used her power, not for revenge but for repair.